to turn to Doug Rand, who has done some very outstanding work over the past couple of years in his role as a senior advisor to the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. And what I think really places Doug in a very unique position to address this issue is that he comes from the private sector, which isn't all that common, I think, for those who are in politics in this town. So it is really delightful to have him here. Doug, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you all for coming. This is a phenomenal panel, and I appreciated all of your perspectives. I was back to follow. I'll be brief because I guess we want to do Q&A, right? So just a quick review of how far we've come and hopefully where we're going. You know, as many of you know, the president has been extremely supportive of common sense immigration reform since before he was president. And has emphasized this at every opportunity, long before I think any of the political commentators thought that comprehensive immigration reform was possible. And the president has long said that any reform of our broken immigration system needs to do at least four things. It needs to strengthen border security beyond the gains we've already made. It needs to provide for stronger interior enforcement, workplace enforcement, so that all employers are playing by the same rules, and that those who do play by the rules aren't being penalized for doing so. It needs to provide a way to bring the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country out of the shadows and contributing fully to this economy. After a bunch of common sense measures like paying back taxes, paying a fine, learning English, taking civics classes, and getting to the back of the line behind everyone else. And fourth, and I think in line with what we've been talking about today, improving our current legal immigration system, both on the family-based immigration side and the employment-based immigration side. So drilling down there onto the employment-based immigration, which includes all the high-skill priorities we've talked about. A number of other things the president has emphasized time and again we should be doing as a nation that are, I think as you said, pretty much no-brainers. One is we should have a green card pathway for entrepreneurs. There are a number of visa pathways that entrepreneurs can utilize, have utilized. We're trying to make it easier under existing law. That's another story we can get into if folks are curious. But there's really no substitute for Congress acting to create a reasonable runway where entrepreneurs who have validated their chance of success by raising a threshold amount of investment from U.S. investors or revenue from U.S. customers can get on that very certain path towards status and ultimately a green card, so that they can build their companies and create jobs and innovation here in the United States. So that's number one, a startup visa. Number two, the stapling issue. You're the best and brightest, you get educated, get a master's or a PhD in a STEM field here in a U.S. institution. There should be, we should take away the obstacles for you getting a green card as rapidly as possible, effectively stapling a green card to your diploma. And the literature on why this would be beneficial is vast and it's already been alluded to. And the third thing is we just need to fix the current system for all people in the employment-based immigration system, and that means clearing up the backlog, and it means mitigating this current problem where not only do we have a fixed number of employment-based green cards every year, but any given country can only account for 7% of that pot. So it's a 140,000 green card pot. Any country can't take up more than 7%. So that's a big problem if you're from China or India or other populous countries, which is the reason that these backlogs are more than a decade for folks from these countries. So we need to do something about that. So the good news is, this past summer, the Senate came together in an overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion. Lots of Republicans, lots of Democrats voting for a bill which passed in June that would accomplish all of these things I just mentioned. It's all of the president's priorities. As he said, it's a compromise. It doesn't have everything he would have wanted. It doesn't have everything anyone would have wanted, but this is how it's supposed to work. You don't have to listen to me. You don't have to listen to anyone in the administration. You can go to the Congressional Budget Office, which is the neutral umpire for the economic impact of any bill under consideration in Congress. And what this Senate bill would do is increase GDP by over $1 trillion over the next couple of decades, reduce our deficit by nearly $1 trillion over the next couple of decades, and generally provide for the kinds of innovation and job creation and benefits that we've all talked about. And that's the neutral arbiter in Congress, the Congressional Budget Office. So the costs of inaction are enormous. The benefits of getting this done are enormous. And so it's over to the House right now. The House of Representatives is really the last step before getting this to the President's desk. And something, I'm actually not allowed to call on people to call their Congress people because I'm not in politics, I'm in policy. Apparently there's a huge difference legally. But that's where we are. And just about everyone under the sun thinks the time is now. The President has repeatedly said the time is now. Look around, and just about every interest group you can imagine is behind this. Labor is behind this. Tech is behind this. The entrepreneur and startup community is behind this. Faith communities. Just in the past week or so, the President met with faith leaders. He met with business leaders, not just in technology, but across the spectrum. Everybody wants this done. And what I think a lot of folks don't realize is that the votes are actually there in the House. The votes are there. If whether it's the Senate bill or some alternative that hits a lot of the same priorities, there's enough Democrats and Republicans in the House right now who have declared their intention to support all of the pillars that I just mentioned, including a path to citizenship for the undocumented, including all of the high skill immigration priorities, that we can get this done. So there's a role that everyone in this room and everyone can play, which is to keep the pressure on, make sure that everyone understands that this is a huge priority, that we can't afford to delay any longer, and that, as the President said, the time is now. Thank you.
Before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to say that when you look at this immigration issue, the whole notion of immigration reform, it makes me think that I don't know of any other issue where you have entities such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Compete America, the Semiconductor Industry Association, the Partnership for a New American Economy, which is led by Michael Bloomberg and Rupert Murdoch, Forward.us, which was launched by Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, and finally Immigration Works USA. These are industry groups. They are saying the same thing that Democrats are saying. They're saying the same thing that Republicans are saying. You listen to the House leadership. They're very sympathetic to this notion, what Brian Tooley calls a no-brainer. It is a no-brainer. How many issues do we know? How many salient public policy issues on the table right now can we identify that have this kind of a broad-based support across the partisan divide that makes policy work so difficult? And that's why I think if there is a resolution in this area, especially when it comes to high-skilled labor, this may be one way of getting this town moving. So that's why I think this whole issue of enabling American institutions to employ who they want to employ, the best talent possible from all over the world, I think this is good for everyone, and it may have the kind of ripple effect that will get us to legislate in this town things that don't have that same kind of across-the-board bipartisan support, and especially industry support. I'm hoping that this conversation continues, and that's why I really look forward to the Q&A part of the conversation this evening. So please share your ideas and questions with us. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much. This is a great discussion from a technology point of view to the immigration. And I have a question for Doug. Brian said this is a no-brainer, and you're absolutely right. Everybody says it's a no-brainer. What's the hold-up in Congress? What is holding up the vote?
Well, the way the House rules work, House leadership has to sign off on anything coming up for a vote. Right? So you have to ask House leadership why and when they're planning on bringing something up for a vote. I think I would defer to my colleagues who are spending a lot of time on the Hill doing incredible work, unprecedented work really, to get this done. And we're talking to the folks with the power to get this done much more frequently than I am. And maybe we can get some insight there as well.
Sure, and Doug, I think said it very well. You know, at this point, it's entirely about House leadership pulling the package together and putting it on the floor. You know, I think the immediate issue that's holding it up is there's just a lot else to do over the next few weeks. It's an unfortunate answer that when you ask them, that's what they'll say. We have a lot of priorities that need to get done. We believe in this. We want to do this. You know, the House leadership has been, you know, committed to this over a period of months. But it is clear that the Senate approach will not work in the House. There needs to be a different approach. But I'm hopeful that once we can get cleared with some of these key issues that we need to get beyond, that we will be able to get it on the floor. And I think many in House leadership and many leaders of committees in the House have stated very clearly their intention to try to move forward with this, and I think we just need to keep the pressure on.
That's absolutely right. I mean, just because this is taking much longer, I think, than everyone who cares about this issue cares for it to take, we can't take our foot off the gas. Right? We got to keep the pressure on. We have to continue to make it clear what a huge priority this is, how high the costs of inaction are, so that you know, the importance of this issue doesn't fade away.
And I believe this right now is the opportunity to get it done. If it fades away for whatever reason in the midst of the midterm elections, I think it's going to be really hard for it to come back up for a while. It's sort of the way Washington works. So now, over the next few months is the time.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for being here again. As an MBA student here, it's really an honor to get to here and add to my education with perspectives. My former background is actually in the engineering field that you described, and I was really interested in Cruz's statement about how master's programs are significantly dominated by international students. And having gone through one of those master's programs before, I tended to notice that. But the point that I noticed was a little bit different was that at the undergraduate level, that's not always the case, and the fact that there is a much higher prevalence of U.S.-born folks that are interested in those fields. So I'm curious as to why you kind of see that difference of the fact that there's a lot more undergraduate students, U.S. National undergraduates than graduate students, and what types of things you can do to even change that thing.
Is that for me?
Yes.
You go all out.
Well, that's an excellent question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for you, but I'll try. So many of the immigrants that come to the U.S. typically get their bachelor's degrees in their home country. They usually graduate from the top institutions, and then they're admitted to the U.S. for their graduate studies. And primarily, I think it's because they have to get that cream of the crop is the ones who really get into the universities. They want to come into at the undergrad level. They usually are not given things like residence, RA-ships or TA-ships, and so on. So I think there's some phenomenon of that nature that affects it. The second aspect that I'm familiar with is when I speak to certain professors, and they want to remain anonymous. Right? What they say is, in order for my students to publish, they need the best students. Okay, so they will actually go out and seek the best students, regardless of country of origin. It just happens to be that, when you look at the world population, the U.S. has 300-some million people in it. The rest of the world is 7 billion, right? So there is talent equally spread everywhere, right? And so it's not a very major surprise that if you're trying to get talent from all over the world, well, it's just a matter of ratios and numbers, right? So that's the second thing. So where the professors are actively seeking the best talent that they can. The other part of your question, you didn't ask about employment. You asked about why the composition is the way it is. Is that correct? Or did you ask about? I'm sorry, I didn't quite. What was the rest of your question?
I was actually asking more about the composition because I noticed that as in my case, being the U.S. citizen that went to a U.S. engineering school, I was plucked out of school and put in a job and was happily employed, and my employer was happy to keep me happily employed rather than to send me back to school. I mean, I got lucky that my employer sponsored my going back to school. That was nice, but I noticed amongst a lot of my colleagues that wasn't necessarily the same case.
So, I'll add something on that's maybe a little apolitical, which is that I do think the culture in this country of the value of education has been eroding. And I don't have all the statistics at my fingertips about sort of how we pay and incent our teachers compared to countries around the world, but I do think there's been a degraded value of education in this country culturally. And a lot of the work that I do around women and girls is very focused on that topic, but it's a broader and well understood and documented issue. It actually gets to your point about the ambition of people from outside of the U.S., which is much more driven in seeing education as a path to career, where I think there's certainly large segments of our population who don't have that motivation and drive, which I think is something that this conversation is a really important. I think it's just a really important part of the conversation and discussion as well. So.
If I could just add one thing onto that. I think the good news is we're making some progress in getting more students interested in pursuing engineering. And that's that is, I think, a very good indicator. People entering undergraduate pursuing engineering. The bad news is that an average, my understanding, of 60% of U.S. students that enter engineering programs, 4 years in engineering programs, drop out of those engineering programs, which is a huge problem. If you do all the work to get people interested, get them finally majoring in engineering, and then more than 60%, at some schools it's much higher than that. And you do not see those numbers in other countries, interestingly. And why is it? As I've talked to students, they said it's hard. Engineering's hard. My friends are all out partying.
That's a little bit of my point.
Yeah, exactly. No, I just want to add it, but it is it's a huge problem that's more than just an isolated incident. Or I think we have to put some sort of policies in universities and maybe working with business to try to have internship programs or something that carries through these students to get them beyond that, because that's an enormous problem we're facing.
Very good. Go ahead.
Just a follow-up question, a quick one. Janet, do you believe that maybe Silicon Valley's and semiconductors echoed golden children like Bill Gates, Zuckerman, Jobs? Do they echo the fact that schools are not given what the entrepreneurs and success need? And perhaps we are doing the wrong branding for our children, that they can leave school and still be billionaires. If that's the case, how do you think we can battle that?
That's interesting, and actually, my friends from Silicon Valley here can probably jump in as adeptly as I can. I don't have a good glib answer to your question. I don't feel like, and I lived through the dot-com hysteria with huge numbers of the people we were trying to recruit, and people from our organization left because they thought they were going to be the next Mark. Well, he was barely born then, but we'll put that in context. Whoever it was then. I think that's probably a distraction, but not at the core of the issue, because I think the core of the issue, and this is, I guess, putting a little of my personal beliefs on the table, is it's actually about the education that people get in their elementary education and their high school. And as a mother of high school kids, I'm sort of living and breathing that every day. That's much more sort of to their core. So I think there probably is some of that. For me personally, I don't see that as a core sort of changer of people's behaviors. And maybe that's a little bit idealistic of me. And maybe I look at the kids on my kids' high school football teams, and I think they pretty much realize they're not going to play professional football, and they need to keep at it. But that's just one person's perspective. I don't know, thoughts on that?
No, I
sort
agree.
of your corner of the universe.
Let me take a stab at this. It's a very good question. And it reminds me of something one of Brian Tuohy's guests, Dean Kamen, who's this famous inventor that Brian brought to campus a couple of weeks ago. What he said, because he is part of this attempt that's got an acronym called FIRST, and it's to promote science and technology education. And what Dean Kamen's been trying to do with this organization is to tell people, you know, sure, it'd be nice if everybody could be a baseball player, you know, professional basketball, but how many people actually make it to that? And so the question there is, sure, Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard, so did Mark Zuckerberg, but how many of them are there that are dropouts compared to people who completed their degrees and succeeded? And there, I think that's part of the answer, perhaps. And another part of it is that we have to make education today relevant, as opposed to, and this doesn't mean that education is just training for jobs, but book learning is not as related or as relevant to our time as facility with technology today. Book learning in some ways is antithetical to the world of technology that changes so quickly and so on. So it's probably a combination of those two things to communicate to students. But it's a really, really good question. Go ahead, please. Oh, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
I agree with everything that's been said here. Just some observations. Really, intrinsic motivation is very important. You cannot pound into somebody's head. So, the fundamental question is, how do we intrinsically get people, our students, to become interested in these difficult subjects? Now, in many countries, there is a very high regard placed on education. What degree you get, especially in engineering. I can name many countries. Korea comes to mind, or China, and many other countries, where the society has created almost a temple, if you will, to the idea of somebody being an engineer, somebody creating, right? So it's a societal thing. And I'm sorry to say that in the U.S., people don't even know what an engineer does. What is an engineer? I mean, I read the papers, and they confuse scientists and engineers. They don't, the distinction isn't even there. That's a fundamental problem, right? The second thing is, people know of engineers as train operators, right? That's the lexicon that we're using. Something's really wrong. Really? How many times, and then the way in which engineers are portrayed is geeks, as opposed to creators, as opposed to inventors. And, I don't know, I open up these various news sites. I don't want to insult anybody, but I go onto the Yahoo news site. What do I see? I see Kim Kardashian all over the place. It's silly. Right? So we have to think about how we are, just look at our society. What are the values that we've created? We can create that temple. We can create that, thing for people to look up to. It's going to take a lot of time.
And I think the flip side to that, because I love your points, I think the flip side is, I do think the tech icons actually can really help. Because I think they can create a sentiment that being an absolute superstar in all things tech is iconic. And so I think it's how do we balance that conversation? Well, not dropping out of school because you think you'll be there and you'll end up waiting tables, right?
Exactly. Go ahead, please.
Hi. I wanted to have a question a little less broad thinking and more focused on what we can do with or without reform. Doug mentioned that there was entrepreneurship visas within the current system that you could talk about if you were curious. I'm curious. You mentioned that you were interested in figuring out ways for the U.S. government to be as efficient and effective as possible. What do you think could be done without broader reform to cure these very pressing you guys have bumped your heads against difficulties in the system that you think could be resolved without reform. What could be done if we can't get John Boehner to move? That is my basic question.
Well, I rephrase this, what are we already getting done, even as we wait for John Boehner to do the right thing? I think, so one thing that we've done at our end is worked with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the agency responsible in large part for the adjudication of visas, to look at, okay, what are all the visas that entrepreneurs have been or could be using? And they actually put together a pretty innovative entrepreneurs in residence program where they said, well, to help us solve this problem, let's bring in experienced entrepreneurs from outside government to do a deep dive deep within our agency and come up not with some report, but with actual deliverables that can help us improve this pathway. And so if you go to uscis.gov/pathways or just Google entrepreneur pathways, you will find the website that this team ultimately created, and it's basically a menu of visas in reasonably plain English that walk you through. Okay, well, depending on what kind of entrepreneur you are, or how much money you've raised, or other elements of your situation, here's what the O1 visa is all about. The O1 visa is for aliens of extraordinary ability, right? So it's historically been used by athletes and Nobel laureates and supermodels and all kinds of folks. It's also been used by entrepreneurs, perhaps in a less high-profile way. And so it walks you through how you would prepare your petition in a way that would, complies with all current laws, but gives you, I think, a lot more insight than was previously possible to put yourself and your petition in the best possible light to be potentially successful. And that's just one example of, I think, a half dozen visas that are on this menu. And then that's in addition to all the stuff that's going on the back end that's not visible to the public in terms of improving the entire adjudication process, so that once your petition comes in, they know, oh, this is from someone who wants to start a company here or grow a company here. And, here are the questions we should be asking that are in line with how startups are actually formed and grown in this country, and a number of unsexy but really important process improvements that are necessary to make the most of the tools we currently have.
Yeah, I would just echo the process improvement comment exactly, which is we do a substantive amount of work for ICE, for Homeland Security, which is all about how to help make our current processes more efficient. This is actually, which is really important, but a different conversation than this one. Hopefully ticking away at the backlog, but certainly not at the level of reform that you're talking about. I didn't know about Pathways, so I learned something new today. Thank you.
Yeah, tell all your friends who want to start companies here as you go check out that website.
Very good. Go ahead, sir.
So my question is really about the high-tech sector, and so I've worked in the high-tech sector for 5 years before business school, and I noticed that both large and mid-sized companies, who want R&D innovation, they rely on these H-1B visas, but at the same time, these are the same companies that use offshore resources for IT support and for development. So, and these offshore companies are the ones who are using a lot of the B1 visas, the H-1B visas. So do you see that as a conflict of interest where you're trying to present a front where you want to support both U.S. workers and international, but at the same time you're relying on these offshore resources to keep the company moving?
Thoughts on that? I don't know that market as well.
So if I could rephrase, or not rephrase, but restate your question just so I can understand, make sure I've got the right question. You're saying on the one hand, the industry is promoting more H-1B visas, or lobbying for more H-1B visas. At the same time, there's a substantial amount of offshoring that's occurring. And some of those visas that are used for offshoring purposes, you're saying they are being used for what purpose? You mentioned.
So a lot of these offshore companies, like, they bring resources on site, and they are the ones who either abuse or use a lot of the H-1B visas and B1 visas. So do you see how the same company that's waiting for H-1B visas for your local workers is relying on this offshore vendor who's...
I can't speak to other companies. I certainly know in my company, when we apply for an H-1B visa for a particular engineer, our intention is to keep that engineer in that's where we believe we're going to get the most value out of that engineering. We really believe in having teams that are very well knit together, very, very focused, and working together very well. There are definitely cases where our company has done this, where we have established design locations outside of the U.S. for IT services, what have you. But I have rarely seen any kind of transfer of these resources between the offshore locations and the onshore locations. In my case, I'm not aware. Maybe other people who are doing this, and I can't comment.
I'll add one thing, which I wanted to mention earlier, which is, of the high-skill immigration priorities that are in the Senate bill and ultimately should make their way into a House bill, startup visa, pretty easy to, understand what that is. Stapling green cards to the forms of the advanced immigrants, pretty easy. But that third one, which is, clearing the backlogs, that's really important, and I don't think it gets enough attention. The Senate bill would effectively more than double the number of green cards that are available to high-skill immigrants. I mean, if you look at, I'm just going to make an assumption that of the foreign-born folks that you're hiring at Maxim, you might be bringing them on with an H-1B, but the vast majority of them you would sponsor for the green card.
That's correct.
Certainly
Right.
at Deloitte as well.
If the green cards were available,
Yes.
right? So one way to take pressure off the H-1B system is to clear out the pathway for green cards. The Senate bill would do that, and in an extraordinarily effective fashion. It creates a bunch of temporary measures to clean out the existing backlog. All those poor folks who are waiting more than a decade for their green cards would be guaranteed to get through that process much faster. And then going forward, it would increase the capacity of the system to absorb more talent on the green card pathway. So this is not just bringing in people for temporary work assignments, but bringing folks into this country and keeping them here and making them Americans, and helping them establish families here and fully contribute to the economy. So that's something really important and I think really game-changing to keep in mind about the legislation that's on the table right now.
Very good. I'm being told that we should go upstairs to room 415 for our wine and cheese. This has been truly delightful. Thank you so much, everyone.